All righty. So let's go. My name's Carl Binder. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the CEO of the Performance Thinking Network, and this is our monthly webinar. We do it almost every month. This next month, we're going to take a month off, as I'll say a little bit later, and we occasionally skip either because of travel plans or because it's the summer and everybody's at the beach or whatever it is. But anyway, this is our monthly session, and it's always fun to do it. I'm gonna look in the chat box. Oh, we got a bunch of chatty people here, which is really cool. All right, so again, this topic, it's not always about the money, and it's kind of it's not quite a perfect title for this thing, but I have to say, it came up in conversations with a colleague some time ago, quite a few months ago, with my old friend and colleague, Karen Reed, who owns a growing multi-location behavioral health company, or a set of them, and who is a little bit complaining to me about how her staff always wanted to get more of those gift cards that they could give out as consequences for doing good work. And so we began a conversation about that, which plugged really right into the way I tend to think about performance. And so it's not exactly just looking farther for positive consequences. It's kind of looking farther for positive motivation. So the other thing, and this is sort of just my punky thing, there's a few people here who come from the applied behavior science world, and OBM, which some of you may not know what that means, some of you may not, but it's organizational behavior management. And that's something that mostly just behaviorists know about, because you don't get jobs for OBM outside of the behavioral community particularly. But it is a field of applied behavior science where people focus a lot on consequences, and they focus quite a bit on things like checklists and scorecards. And there's a limited set of tools that are used. And it's part of my own background to some extent, but I would argue that performance engineering is a bigger scope thing that comes from Tom Gilbert, among others. And so in some respects, what I want to talk about here is beyond what typically OBMers might think about some of these topics. So here's the agenda broadly. I want to talk just briefly about Skinner's behavior science, because everything I do, everything I've been doing for 50 years is based on the fact that I was a student with Skinner, and I devoted myself to trying to make applications of his science available. And so, but Tom Gilbert, on the other hand, who among others was sometimes called the father of human performance technology, talked about behavior engineering. And I want to talk a little bit about how that evolved from Skinner's science, and then talk about positive consequences, which is sort of the presenting topic here, and the use of what in the behavioral world is known as reinforcement, typically, which are consequences that actually increase the frequency of people doing whatever the behavior is that they follow. But then I want to expand beyond that and talk a little bit about the fact that there's really a performance system going on here. There's a whole bunch of behavior influences, and they all intersect with one another. They all are aligned with one another. It's not just a sort of a menu that you can select from. It's a system to be optimized, which then is the next topic about how we think about that. And then there's one last topic, and it's really sort of just a poke at something that an author named Daniel Pink wrote about many years ago, where he talked about, well, we shouldn't really be rewarding people for what they do. We should assume that, we should work with intrinsic motivation, whatever that might mean. And I want to give you a little bit of flavor for what that means, at least to me and my colleagues. So that's kind of the agenda. We've got some more webinars coming, not necessarily in this sequence, but we want to talk a bit about exemplary performance, exemplary behavior analysis, which we always recommend to people in our practitioner program, especially as a thing to do if you've got superstars. How do you identify people who are really productive, really extraordinarily better in their performance and productivity than average? And how do you figure out what the tricks are that enable them to do that? And what are the implications of that? I want to talk a little bit about leadership and management for engagement and productivity, which we've already talked about in a variety of ways, but we'll come back to that topic in various ways. And then also talk about performance coaching and counting. There's actually an experiment that I've begun with one of my colleagues who works with me. And we're always talking about the fact that one of the cool things about work outputs or accomplishments, as we define them, is you can count them. So how about if you're managing and coaching people and you define their accomplishments or outputs at a fairly fine grade level, and you have as part of your conversation with them, let's see how many whatevers you produced this week and so forth. And so this is kind of an experiment, and we probably won't do this session for a while, but my colleague who is here with us, Ian, and I are sort of engaging in that experiment right now. And then I want to talk about something we talk about in our practitioner program, implementation and change management with performance thinking. We have sort of a different take on that than the typical change management methodologies, and we'll address that. Now, next time, which is not going to be till September, and I realized after I set the date, it's 9/11, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But I wanted to stand back and take a look at performance thinking, because if you look at our YouTube channel, this will be the 43rd webinar we've done. We've been doing this for almost 4 years. And what you recognize is that the YouTube channel reflects a whole bunch of different applications, different ways you can use the two simple models and logic of performance thinking to do useful things. And so I want to stand back from that. And there's two reasons for it. One of them is that over the next about 6 months, we're going to launch a new phase in our business, which is what we're calling application kits. Small, inexpensive digital products that are templates for specific kinds of applications that will be made available online and will be very inexpensive. And those will be different applications. But again, for the sake of anybody who might be interested in our work, this next session in September is going to be kind of a zoom back and look at the whole picture and all the kinds of things that we could do with these two simple models and plain English words. Now, I just flipped a slide unintentionally, but now I'll do it intentionally, which is there's two things about the slide you're looking at right now. First of all, I realized the other day when I was working with the current open practitioner program folks that I am working with, that a bunch of them from the sort of applied behavior science, applied behavior analysis world are familiar with the term of contingency that we use in behavior science. But one of the other participants who is really sharp and really good and works in a large corporate environment was not familiar with that term. And I sort of forgot about that. And so let me tell you what this means. B.F. Skinner, who was really the father of modern behavior science, he and his proteges and students and those who've evolved the work of applied behavior science and basic research also talk about contingencies. And what they mean is the dependent relationship between the elements of performance. So if I respond and there is a positive consequence arranged to happen if I respond appropriately, that is a contingency. The contingency being, if you do X, the following consequence will occur. And similarly, there are contingencies between antecedents, things that come before behavior that eventually come to prompt that behavior because they're followed again by consequences. So contingency means the relationship between the environment and the behavior. And this very nerdy looking little equation, you might call it an equation beneath it, which we refer to as the three-term contingency. And most behaviorists know about this, but other people don't think about it, at least in these terms, these rather nerdy terms. But what an SD is a discriminative stimulus. In other words, it's a cue or a prompt or a signal that has come to occasion some behavior, to prompt some behavior because it's been followed by consequences. And so here in this little equation, it's discriminative stimuli set the occasion for responses, which ideally are followed by reinforcing stimuli, that is, positive consequences. And we only call those things reinforcing stimuli if they actually do increase the frequency of behavior. So this is what Skinner used to frame the work he did in the laboratory starting in the 20s, literally the 1920s, and in which he revolutionized really the field of experimental psychology with his experimental analysis of behavior using behavior frequency or rate of response, which was his most important contribution, the measurement of this. So this is where it started out. This is Skinner's model in the laboratory. But what Tom Gilbert, who some of you may know about, recognized, and Tom actually worked for a short time with Skinner in the Office of Program Instruction, but Tom recognized that when you move outside the laboratory, it's a little bit more complicated than that, because in the basic research lab, where you might have pigeons or monkeys or rats or other kinds of organisms, you make the assumption pretty much that these individuals are more or less the same. And so if you have a reinforcing stimulus for one, for a hungry rat, it'll probably work for other hungry rats too. If you have an antecedent like a light that works for this pigeon, it will probably work for that pigeon as well. So you don't take individual differences into account in the laboratory. And of course, we're focusing on reinforcing stimuli in this particular webinar. But what Gilbert recognized after one of our colleagues made sort of plain Englished the three-term contingency by talking about antecedents, behavior, and consequences, or ABC. What Gilbert recognized is that in the world of work, as he called it, with us humans, there are both the things that are arranged in the environment. He called them data, instruments, and incentives. And there are things that are involved, the individual or the person. And so he has these columns that line up with the three terms of Skinner's equation. And he thought of discriminative stimuli or antecedents as providing information of then the ability to respond, or the tools and resources or instruments, as he described it, for responding. And then the motivational component being incentives, consequences, basically, and the motives, that is, the things we care about, so that those things really are incentives. Now, Gilbert introduced this model called the behavior engineering model in the 70s and published his rather famous book, Human Competence, in 1978, which is still taught in graduate schools. And I encountered it in about 1981 or 1982. And it was really powerful, because I was doing fluency-based instruction with salespeople and customer service people in corporate environments. I went from the educational world, in which we spent 10 years doing research and development and teacher training, doing precision teaching and laboratory work also, to the world of business, with which my mentor, Ogden Lindsley, sort of kicked me into. And when I saw this, I got very excited about it, because what I realized was, for example, with our sales training programs, where we had learning processes that involved practice on your own on a daily basis to achieve what we call fluency, or quick, easeful, accurate performance, talking about products, asking questions, doing the various kinds of verbal and nonverbal behavior that salespeople need to be able to do. So they had to practice this, ideally every day. But we didn't have control over them every day. We could bring them together in the classroom, but once they were out of the classroom, we really didn't have much influence on them. So what we recognized is we were sort of living, if you will, or providing support down in the knowledge component, sort of a training thing. But that if we wanted those folks to practice on their own, we were going to have to provide some information about what they ought to be doing. And we needed to be able to give them some tools like sheets, data sheets, to monitor their practice, and we needed to give them some recognition, some incentives. And so this was an exciting model test. We thought, yes, this gives us a framework for looking at all the factors that influence performance. But the trouble is, as you can see, the language that Tom Gilbert used for his model, and many of you know about this because you have been through our programs and so forth, but the language was an obstacle. And when we started working with corporate folks, they would say, well, what do you mean by data? Is that like spreadsheets, or what is that? And we'd say, oh, well, that's the information that people need in order to know what they're supposed to do and produce. And it's the information they get to know how they're doing it. Oh, okay. How about instruments? Is that like a ukulele or what is that, an ohm meter? People confused that. They didn't know what we're talking about. Oh, those are the tools, the resources, the things that people use as they perform that enable them to respond effectively, whether it's process design or job aids or screwdrivers or whatever it is. And then incentives, that made perfect sense. But what about things that are not planned? Because incentives sound like something that you say, if you do this, you'll get that consequence, which is great. But what about unintended consequences? If, for example, having a terrible process or a bad piece of software that kind of has an unintended consequence built in it, punishes doing the right thing. So what about that? Where does that go? And then knowledge was okay, but is there any place in here that skills fit? And the word capacity was confusing to people because it sort of sounded like a lot of people thought it was organizational capacity. But what Gilbert meant was the individual's capacity to be able to use the instruments to respond in the appropriate way. In simple terms, are you strong enough to be a dock worker? Are you analytical enough to be a accountant or whatever? How do you fit? How do your skills, knowledge, personal capabilities, and so forth line up with what we ask you to do? So that's really about selection and assignment, you might say. And then motives was a good word, but there's also kind of preferences in there. There's more than just I'm motivated by this incentive, because this was Tom Gilbert's way of being sure, we can arrange incentives, but if people don't care about them, it's not going to work. So we have to check their motives. So this was the tool, the framework, the model that Tom Gilbert presented. It's still widely used worldwide, the behavior engineering model, or BEM as it's sometimes called. But I got frustrated in the early 80s because, our clients kept misunderstanding it and making category errors when we tried to communicate with them. It would, sort of be like this, like, tell me again, what is that instruments thing, So I started, as many of our colleagues did, but I took a little bit different approach. I was influenced to some extent by Apple Computer and user testing of user interfaces and such. And so we took this approach. We started tweaking the language in the cells, trying different stuff with clients until we got language where there weren't many misunderstandings, that we could present the model with the framework, with our labels, and people would sort of get it and they wouldn't make a lot of mistakes. So that's why we created the 6 boxes model. And we really didn't, I sort of finally arrived at it in about 1990 or so. And I arrived there because I could go in and tell people, I could spend 10, 15 minutes, maybe draw this model out and label it on a napkin or a piece of paper, literally. And I could come back and they were kind of using it in a smart way. But then my then late dear colleague and client, Tom Hogan, who was senior vice president of sales training at Dun & Bradstreet, I was struggling over what to call this thing in a meeting with some of his people at one point, because I wanted to give Tom Gilbert credit. And I said, well, it's kind of the behavior engineering model, but you can see it's different. And so Tom just says from the back, well, why don't you call it you always talk about those boxes. Why don't you call it the 6 boxes? So that's how it got its name. And then we trademarked it. So that is the model. And this is not that big a deal, but a few years ago at the International Society for Performance Improvement conference, one of our colleagues, unbeknownst to me until afterwards, had a session where they were sort of nominating and voting for the best performance model in the world, and our model got it. So it was a small group of people, so I'm not going to make a big deal of that. But I think the point is that the model is very usable and it's user friendly. And this we can expand into. So if you take the labels of the 6 boxes model and you start to flesh out the things that go into each of those categories, one of the things that comes from behavior science in this work is that those categories are what we call functionally defined. In other words, anything that functionally sets expectations and provides feedback to people that actually works goes in box 1. And anything that actually is a tool or a resource that someone would use as they were doing a job, whether it's documentation, a screwdriver, a person they can turn to, a job design or process flow, those are the things that go in box 2. Anything that functions as a consequence or incentive, whether it is money or thank you, that actually makes it more likely that people will behave and so forth. So this is a sort of a fleshed out, more detailed view of what goes into the positive version of the 6 boxes model. And of course, the conversation today is about consequences. So this is our silly thing when we introduce box 3, consequences and incentives. We want to say love or money, and it's a little more than that. And I was trying to decide whether to include this graphic or not, but there's a certain way in which it's very true, because money represents kind of tangible stuff. Maybe not just money, but tangible things that you get if you do well at something, if you perform well. And love is more like the experience you have, if you do the thing. And, if we love our work, there may be quite a bit of love in there. So it's a little bit silly, but the main point is the definition here. What we say that box 3, or consequences and incentives, are formal and informal, tangible or intangible results of behavior that increase or decrease its likelihood of performance, of occurrence. And of course, today we're sort of talking about the increase part. Now, Aubrey Daniels, who was a friend, still alive, but he was a friend of mine and a colleague and a senior guy, really important person in the field of applying behavior science. He wrote a whole bunch of books, but I love this one, both for performance professionals and for leaders and managers. Bring out the best in people. And the part I really like about it is the subtitle, How to Apply the Astonishing Power of Positive Reinforcement. And Aubrey filled his books, his teaching, his workshops, his presentations about examples of how positive consequences can make an enormous difference for people. And that's at the core of what we're talking about here. But what we also want to talk about is sort of expand beyond just tangible things. So that's where we want to go. Now, one of the points that Aubrey made, I don't know if he coined this term, but I credit him with it, discretionary effort. And what he talked about in this book was, if you want people to really put out, so to speak, really go beyond expectations, then, it doesn't work to just give them deadlines. Because typically, and many of us work under deadlines, myself included, if you're working primarily under deadlines, what happens, as most of you know, it's the technical term would be a fixed interval schedule reinforcement. But a deadline is something typically where you kind of do some work as a deadline appears. You work faster and harder, and you may stay up all night because if we don't make the deadline, something bad happens. And so this is the kind of performance you tend to get, essentially compliance, or just kind of meeting the standards, if you're under the typical conditions of the consequences you get are avoiding bad stuff if you make the deadline. And what Aubrey pointed out was that if we reinforce, if we have positive consequences for behavior ongoing, that people do more behavior to get more consequences, and that's worth what he called discretionary effort. And so his point, and it's a very important point, is if you live in a world of work where there's a lot of positive stuff that happens, the better you do, the more you produce, et cetera, then, you get a lot more from people, and people are happy to do it. And it's ultimately worth money in some ways if you're in any kind of an organization that has a financial component. So that's a big deal. It's very important. But there's more to than that. First of all, just to sort of play with the title of this session, there's a lot of positive consequences. And this is just a few examples. One of the things we do in both our coaching and management programs, as well as at our performance consulting certification program, is that we have people brainstorm things that they can do in their world that fit into the cells of the 6 boxes. And this is just a short list of some of the things that some of our colleagues and clients have listed as things that they've used that can function as positive consequences. This is a good list. It's certainly beyond the money, but it's all still about stuff that you arrange in some way or other, or that is about consequences, box 3. And I think we knew this. I think this is not a big, anything other than the notion that there's more to it than just money or formal stuff or gift cards, that you can say thank you. And if you do it enthusiastically, or if you give somebody feedback and say, I really like the way that paragraph came out that you just did, that's beautiful. They'll probably be doing more of that later, so it's not always about tangible stuff. But there's more to it than that. And that's where I want to talk about the whole thing, because one way to think about the 6 boxes model is it reflects a system in which every one of these functional categories are connected. And we've talked about this before in our webinars. We always talk about it in our programs. But I want to sort of step through it a little bit. And it's an interesting exercise for any of you who are kind of, know about this stuff, to get you and your colleagues thinking about what are the ways that each of the cells in this model connect. And so, for starters, If you set expectations for something, for somebody to do or produce something, if you don't arrange some consequences, or if some good thing doesn't happen when they do it, they're not likely to keep doing it. Aubrey Daniels used to talk about, you can tell people to do stuff, but if nothing ever good happens after they do it, they may not be paying much attention to you after that. So that's one obvious thing, which is that in order for consequences to actually be useful, ideally they're lined up with some expectations that have been set. And then, for example, if we set expectations and provide feedback to use tools in a certain way, you should talk to John if you need help, or this is how to do this with the following, the following tool, or perhaps more obviously, if you give people a job aid, a job aid, or a standard operating procedure document, or an online performance support tool in box 2, very often tools like that, job aids, actually set expectations because they say you should do this like this. So very often you get a thing which functions in both expectations and feedback and tools and resources. And of course, if it does, that will enable you to make contact with the natural consequences. You can also have tools and resources that are great, that people even love to use. I mean, it's like my car. I know this is a silly example, but a couple of years ago, I bought a Tesla, and I love driving the car. It's just fun to drive. And so, it's a tool to go to the store or to go to the beach or whatever it is you're doing. But I swear there are times when I just try to think of reasons to drive my car into town because it feels good to drive it. That's an extreme case where the tool is so much fun, you just want to use it. But it's also true that if you have a lousy tool or a lousy process or something that's really a problem, there can be unintended consequences as a result of that where people just avoid it. And it becomes kind of, general, like, nah, don't do it that way. I know the boss says you're supposed to do it, but that process sucks. Do it this way. And so a lot of times you have consequences that are unintended that are the byproduct of not so good tools, or maybe of good tools. And then you can have, of course, box 3 and 6 are connected, because the whole reason that Tom Gilbert, I believe, had this cell called motives was, as we know, a consequence that is not effective if people don't care about it. So if I don't really like the beach, or I don't really like warm weather, and you say, oh, if you do this, you're going to get President's Club and go to Hawaii, you may say, oh man, I'd rather sit in my backyard and play poker or whatever. So you need to be sure that people care about, that they have motives related to the consequences, so that the consequences will actually make a difference. And say expectations and feedback and skills or knowledge are rather interesting too, because if you set expectations for people to do something in a certain way, and if you provide feedback for when they do it, you can often develop skills and knowledge without formal training. It's one of the reasons why coaching and supervision can be very effective if it's thought of as a development process where I'm just going to be real clear with you about it. This is how you should do it. Let me watch. Can you do it? Oh, good. Very nice. And so you can actually use expectations and feedback to develop skills and knowledge. And of course, if you get good at skills and knowledge, ultimately you're going to make contact with the natural consequences. And there's other ways that works too, but those are examples. Tools and resources, again, Gilbert thought of that relationship as we need to have people who are capable of using the tools and resources to do whatever the job is. So there needs to be a good fit there between the environment we ask people to work in and them, whatever it is. We can talk about skills and knowledge in tools and resources too, because again, I mentioned, let's say we have a really good job aid and it steps people through how to do something. And if they do it enough with that job aid, especially if you throw in a little bit of feedback, then they may develop skills and knowledge, without you having to do formal training. A flip side to that is, if you give people a tool like a piece of software, if they don't know how to use it, if they don't have the skills and knowledge to use it, it's not going to be much use. So those two things are very tightly connected. Tools and resources and motives and preferences. Some people, I have a problem very often with icons on software. I actually like verbal, words on my menus. That's a trivial example, but you can get less trivial than that. And you probably know very well in your own case and other people's case that people prefer certain kinds of tools or processes or resources. They maybe prefer to look stuff up versus talk to somebody, et cetera, uh, et cetera. So there's connections there for sure. Um, Expectations and feedback, selection and assignment. One of the single biggest hiring problems that I've seen, and we actually have a case study in our practitioner program about this, is that people get hired into jobs where the job descriptions and the expectations for that job are not really clear during the hiring process. And then they get in the job, it's like, wait a minute, it's some of you are from the applied behavior analysis world, for example, and you know very well you hire people who decide, well, I kind of like children and I don't want to work at Starbucks, so I'll be a behavior technician, working with kids. And then they get into it and they realize, whoa, I didn't realize I had to work with these big, tough kids that beat me up if I'm not careful or whatever. In other words, very often, if the expectations for behavior and outputs are not really crisp during the hiring process, you got a problem eventually. Selection, assignment, and consequences. You want people to be lined up with what's available. You want to be sure that they are happy with the salary that they're going to be getting, or the form of compensation, or the benefits, et cetera. Skills and knowledge, selection, assignment, same deal. You select people very often based on the prerequisite skills and expertise that they bring into the job. So those things are connected. Selection, assignment, and motives and preferences. We want to be sure we hire people who are lined up with the values of our company. Steve Jobs always used to say, I don't want people to work at Apple because, we pay them a lot. I want them to work at Apple because they love Apple products. And you can say the same thing. If you're an applied behavior analysis business, or if you're in some engineering business or whatever it is, if you don't actually care about the purpose of the company, its mission, vision, values, why bother? It's probably not going to be a sustained job situation for you. Skills and knowledge, motives and preferences, same kind of thing. Some people, they want to learn stuff and they say, if my job development, if my performance development opportunities relate to these skills and knowledge, that would be great because I want to be able to move up in this kind of career path. What else we got? Skills and knowledge and consequences. If you're fluent, and this is a whole topic that I spent a good portion of my career on, when you have sufficient practice to get quick and easeful at doing things, it feels good. And so one of the best ways to get people happy about their jobs is to be sure that they have an opportunity to get good at them. Classic example, we actually published an article about this years ago from our work at AT&T Wireless customer call centers. And this was in the early 2000s when AT&T was hiring customer service people really fast because cell phones were relatively new and they were just ramping up their call centers related to cell service. And typically in that environment, it took about 2 months for new customer service reps to get up to the productivity benchmark levels of calls per hour, solutions per hour, customer satisfaction ratings that were expected of a competent employee. Well, we were able to reduce that to 2 weeks from 2 months, which you can imagine got the executive's attention. But the big way we were able to do that is that the training involved very focused practice on the verbal things that you need to be, asking questions, answering questions, directing people this way, that way, as well as all of the software systems they had to use. Instead of just sort of messing around with it, we gave them very timed, efficient practice that looked like a learning gym. And within a couple of weeks, they were up to speed on all this stuff and they were off to the races. So if you build skills and knowledge, you not only get productivity, but you get some pretty happy employees usually too. In fact, in that case, we had employees who didn't go through our fluency-based training, seeing these reps at the end of their training day say, I don't know what's going on, but I want what they want, because they were all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. And then this last one that we often emphasize, which is that if all of the behavior influences are lined up and positive with one another, if they're all working together, then you're going to have some pretty happy people. And that's why we have attitude in there. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. But the thing is, if all of this is working for you, your expectation when you walk into the office in the morning is probably, this is going to be pretty good, or the factory, wherever it is you're working. And so on the other hand, if all that stuff is messed up in the first 5 boxes, if it's out of alignment, if it's not working together, then your probably expectation is going to be, oh, geez, I got to put another day in at the work job, be glad when that's over. So this is a system, and you can't pull out separate pieces very effectively and have it work very well. So let's drill into sort of what I just said in a little bit more detail. Again, expectations and feedback. How does this affect people's motivation? Well, if you're real clear what's expected of you and it's a reasonable expectation, then usually people kind of are at ease. It's like, oh, okay, that's good. And of course, if they get feedback, especially if it's like, yeah, that's really good the way you did that, that can also function as a consequence. An enthusiastic manager, supervisor who points out something you did well. I mean, I've had people, I've just stopped for a moment when somebody has written something or done something, and I'd say, that's really good. I've had them tell me that made a difference, and those are simple, inexpensive things you can do. But my point is that good ongoing feedback can itself function as a consequence. And then the other thing that's important, and I already mentioned this in the connection between boxes 1 and 3, is when we set expectations, we ought to say something or somehow recognize when people meet or exceed them. That's, expectations, like Aubrey Daniels said, if you set expectations and then there are no positive consequences, nobody's going to pay much attention. So that's box 1. Box 2, I've already said this, but I like the word frictionless when it comes to tools and resources. I like processes, job aids, electronic performance support systems, user interfaces, access to screwdrivers and hammers, whatever it is, that basically are easeful. If we can arrange an environment where everything kind of works for people, then that feels pretty good. And usually it's built in, there are positive consequences. And of course, the other side is also true, which is if all of that stuff is inaccessible, poorly designed, missing, clunky, confusing, then it really punishes behavior. And an important one that we'll come back to a little bit shortly is managers can be thought of as an important resource for people. And a manager can sort of own the rest of the 6 boxes and help people get what they need. And so managers as resources, we don't want our managers to sit in their offices in front of spreadsheets. We want them engaged with people in ways that arrange behavior influences for them. And this is a side note, but some years ago, one of my late mentors, Don Tosti, used to talk about trust and cynicism in management contexts. And one of the things that we recognized years ago was that trust happens, like Covey, the junior Covey talks about the speed of trust. People trust the organization of their management when somebody sets expectations for them, and then they get the resources to do it, and they get the recognition when they're successful. That's how we build trust, by rewarding what we say we want and by providing people with the resources they need. And the flip side to that is trust goes away and people become cynics if the organization says, oh, you got to do this, and then they pull the rug out from underneath them, or they don't give them the resources they need, or they don't even notice when they were good at it. Jumping to box 4, since box 3 is kind of the focus of this thing. If you've looked over the last couple of years since COVID and since people talked about the Great Resignation, one of the most frequent reasons you see on surveys and exit interviews about why people are leaving a company is because they didn't have opportunities to develop. They didn't have opportunities that lined up with their interests to develop skills and knowledge. And so that's a huge one as a reinforcer. Like if I get to go to a class and I understand how that class is going to help me going forward, I'm all in. So that's, just access to skills and knowledge can be a reinforcer or a consequence. And again, what we learned from years of my research and our colleagues, both with kids and with adults, is that when you achieve fluency, that feels good and you like it. And you also make contact with the natural consequences. Box 5, I already mentioned this, but if we put people in the right jobs and tasks, and if the expectations are clear, then that will enable them to get the natural payoff of doing that job well. And one of the things I also mentioned, but I think it's worth highlighting, is if you have in your hiring process some kind of a question or a conversation about what do you really care about? Like one of my old friends who owns a large and growing behavioral health organization talks about the fact that usually in their hiring process, they ask people, if you weren't getting paid for stuff, what would you do? What's your favorite thing, kind of? And they try to figure out a way to take that favorite thing and build it into the person's job, at least a little bit, because they want it to line up with something that person cares about. Finally, motives and preferences, as we already said, if we don't, my ex-partner, Cynthia Rhea, enlightened me about 15 years ago when she said, for a leader manager, box 6 is the first thing. You better understand your people's motives and preferences, because then you can arrange everything else, including consequences, to work for them. And of course, if the organization shares your values, then you're more motivated to work with them. Now, sort of continue this direction of engaging people. One of the beauties of performance thinking, by identifying work outputs or accomplishments, not just going from behavior to results, is that it's a lot easier to say how this widget or this decision or this treatment plan or this relationship contributes to our organization's results than to say, if you behave in the following way, it'll make a difference. So just focusing on work outputs or accomplishments helps you connect people up, and people like to be connected up to the purpose of the organization. And as I've already made reference to, we learned over many years when we working with the 6 boxes model that when you get all that stuff working together and positive, you've got a happy camper. But if you don't, you can't fix that young lady. You're going to have to change boxes 1 to 5. You can't just crank it up by saying, you got to improve your attitude or give them a consequence. You got to have the whole thing working in order to really engage people. And that reminds me of, or leads to, the conversation about employee engagement. And probably most of you know about this, but the Gallup organization has been doing polling with this very simple 12-item survey in large organizations for several decades. And it's about employee engagement. And it's definitely more than consequences. And these are the 12 items. I know it's expected of me at work. I have the materials and equipment I need. At work, I have the opportunity to do what I do best every day. And so what they do is they give employees these items, and they get to score it or rate it from not at all, 1, to a whole bunch, 5. And so then they sum up the data and they look at it. And what they found is companies that score in the top 25%, of the top quartile on that little simple 12-item thing, they have a lot less absenteeism and turnover. They have a lot less safety problems. They have fewer product defects. They have higher productivity and profitability. These are real numbers, right? So you're not going to have senior executives saying, it's a bunch of fuzzy stuff. They're going to open their eyes and say, we better have engaged employees, huh? And so if you take, and this was my big aha, if you take the Gallup 12 and sort them into the 6 boxes model, it's quite a remarkable alignment. And in fact, it really was aha. I remember when I looked at these things, I said, wait a minute. And you could quibble over exactly how I've sorted these. Some of them might fit into more than one cell, but it's still fairly impressive that the whole thing related to employee engagement lines up perfectly with what we know from behavior science and behavior engineering, performance engineering, about what enables people to perform well. And of course, the natural implication of that is if you're a leader or a manager or a supervisor, as researchers in employee engagement point out over and over again, you really work for that person. You may work for the company, but basically you're working for your supervisor or your manager. They're the ones that have control. And so we always say that sort of the whole point, the whole job of being a leader or manager is to arrange conditions so that employees will be both productive and engaged, happy with their work. We don't just want slave drivers. We want people who have discretionary effort, and they're productive and they like it. So they're going to stick around and be happy to be part of the organization. And so we spent a few years, quite a while ago, doing this kind of an exercise with groups of leaders and management. We say, what do leaders do? And things like provide a vision, offer guidance, etc. And then what do managers do? And it was similar, but often a longer list, overlapping list. And this is not about the discussion about the difference between leaders and managers, because you can make all kinds of distinctions. But fundamentally, at least in my view, either one of those roles, or supervisor or coach, are about arranging conditions so their people will do well and be happy with it. So here's the Gallup 12 again, sorted into it. And what we did is we looked at what we've learned from the 6 boxes over 25, 30 years, and sort of integrated it with this, and we came up with this list of best practices. Now, some of you who've been around this work for a while have seen this list before. We've talked about it in the context of employee engagement. We've talked about it in the context of if you're going to be a leader or manager, these are the things that optimally you should do. And in fact, we piloted a small program with 60 leaders in the behavioral health world a few months ago, in a virtual program where we had people talking about what they did well in each of these cells, and what some of the practices and tactics they and their colleagues had that really made this work, and then what they didn't do so well, and then sharing some of the things that they knew worked better as a fundamental kind of ground for continuous leadership development, continuous management development. And we're actually, our first application kit, which I'll mention in a while, is going to be built around this because we've piloted this thing. But the idea is, if you're a leader, manager, or performance professional, training and development person, process person, organizational development person, staff functions, staff in line, as they say, if you can collaborate together to be sure this stuff is all happening, you're going to have very happy campers, and you're probably not going to have managers coming to you and say, could you give me some more of those, those cash cards, because, gift cards, because my people are not so happy. If this stuff's all happening, you may need, let's put it this way, you may need fewer of those gift cards, to get back to Karen's original thing. So one last thing I want to talk about, and then we'll see if anybody has any comments. And I surely hope you have questions or comments. There was a book some years ago, a guy named Daniel Pink, and some of you may know about him. And the book was called Drive. And he was one of a fair number of other people out there who are not behavior scientists, who are sort of journalists, or whatever you want to call them, who talked about intrinsic motivation. And these are the people who say you shouldn't reward children for doing well, or you shouldn't give people bonuses for doing well in the job. We want people to be intrinsically motivated, and that's what you should care about. Now, from my point of view, it's hot air, the way they talk about it. And Aubrey Daniels used to say, well, when somebody's first starting their job, that's like asking them to climb a ladder where the first rung is 8 feet above their head. You need to get people and recognize when they do stuff that's moving in the direction of the behavior that they need. You need to use external consequences sometimes, what I would call arranged or programmed consequences. So the first bullet point there, the notion that arranged consequences, whether it's good job, I like the way you just did that, enthusiastic feedback, or whether it's, money or bonuses or whatever it is, that's especially important initially when people are beginning to learn new behavior, and they're beginning to just get so they can do something. What I would say is that more and more, however, if we can enable people through all the rest of the behavior influences, through clear expectations, through frequent feedback, much of which is positive, some of which is corrective, by being sure that they have the tools, resources, systems, access to people that are needed, blah, 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 to do their job well, to be sure that they do have an opportunity to develop the skills that they need, to be sure that it's a pretty good fit for their interests, for their capabilities, for their personalities, that is selection and assignment, and be sure that we understand their motives and preferences so we can manage all the rest of it. That they will and if we, by the way, back in box 4, if we provide opportunities to practice and or job aids to practice with so that people actually become fluent, we're going to be able to connect them up with what I would call the natural consequences. So I don't know about you, but if I write an article or a job or let's say a social media post, or if I create some practice activity for my clients, or if I send an email to somebody which is well written, I feel pretty good about that. I like my own good products if I'm good at the thing. And the same thing goes if I've developed the skills to have good working relationships with people. There's a lot of positive consequences built into that. So I like to think about natural consequences. And coming back to Karen's original prompt for this whole session, Yes, it may well be that gift cards would be a helpful thing. I'm not dissing that altogether. But frankly, if you look at the other behavior influences and be sure that your people have conditions optimized so that they're a good fit for the job, they know what they're supposed to do and produce, they're getting a fair amount of feedback about doing it well, they're getting corrective feedback as needed, they have the opportunity to develop the skills and capabilities that they need, their environment, tools, and resources are working for them, etc. I don't think you're going to need too many extra gift cards. Let's put it that way. So that's kind of this whole notion of trying to unpack what it would mean to talk about intrinsic consequences. So just the shameless commerce bit here is we do have a practitioner program coming up. It's still got some open seats. Starts September 9th. This is the open version that I do 4 times a year for people who come from different places. If you're interested, please get in touch with us and we can set up a conversation with me to talk about whether it's a good fit for you and stuff. And you can point your phone at that QR code if you like to find out more details about it. We also have a long time management and performance coaching program that was done entirely face to face because we thought, oh, well, coaching and supervision happens face to face before COVID. And when COVID hit, pretty much most of our big clients stopped training their people very much. And so in the process, we did a fairly thorough redesign of the program to make it virtual. So it's built on a bunch of virtual sessions. And we've, for various reasons, since the beginning of this year, wanted to find places to pilot this. And so if your organization or even a professional association are interested in piloting a virtual coaching program, please reach out because we'd love to work with you. I mentioned the application kits. I show you this list of best practices because the first one of them is really going to be a leadership and management development tool built around these best practices. The intention of the application kits, we sort of discovered this as we did our webinars over the last 3 years, are specific templated applications of performance thinking where we can offer a kit that has some worksheets and some instructional videos for really cheap, like well under $100 a person, maybe $49.95 or whatever, depending on the thing. So it's really inexpensive, and people can work with their people, using these or learn from them individually. And so if you want to get on the mailing list for those, when we finally come out with them, you can point your phone at that QR code, and I think it will let you give us your email stuff. And as you know, I think probably most people here know, these webinars get recorded and they show up in a few days on YouTube. So our YouTube channel, performancethinking.tv, we got 42 of these now. There's a lot of free stuff. And we have colleagues we've even got some colleagues who've started study groups and stuff around them. And we've built a few webinar study guides, although we've kind of paused on that because there were other things going on. But if you want to get on the mailing list for those study guides, again, you can point your phone at that QR code. And of course, once this is on YouTube, I'd appreciate your subscribing, your sharing, your passing on the links. So by the way, here's my email address down here. It's, as you can see, I don't have the @ in there because I already get way too much spam. But if you want to email me, that's how to get there. And these are some of our free resources. So that's what I have to say today. I don't know if it addressed, I don't know if, I guess Karen is not with us, but at least 1 or 2 people, actually Kayla's here twice, it looks like, who work with her are present. So I hope this sort of addressed the topic. But what do you think? Any questions or comments? And I think we can do, if you want to speak up, I think you can request to talk because it's a pretty small group here. Any comments, questions, ideas? You still awake? Thank you, Greg, for showing up. So Jeremiah, I'm curious of you say very interesting view on trust. Do you think it makes sense? This notion that trust is built on, basically following up from expectations. Oh, you got 3 of us. Okay, Robert, good deal. Fantastic. Yeah, I did notice. I've forgotten some people's names too, I confess. Any other comments or questions? We don't have to prolong this if you don't want to, but I always appreciate what people might have gotten as insights or what you think about this. Let me ask you again, do you think that comment about trust makes sense? Certainly something that I kind of learned from Don Toasty directly. Yeah, go. So Kayla, you want to talk? I think you can do it. Let's see. There we go. I don't know if that worked. I can't hear. I should know how this thing works. Okay, chat. So Aaron thinks it works. So somehow I think I might have screwed up on the. What do you think of Aubrey's emphasis on timely consequences? Well, I think Erwin. So Erwin's question: what do I think of Aubrey Daniels' emphasis on timely consequences? Well, we know from the laboratory, that immediate reinforcement is more powerful than delayed reinforcement. But I also think that humans, because we have verbal behavior, can bridge that sometimes. So I think it's important to recognize, I don't want to wait till next month to tell you what a good job you did on this. So I think feedback and consequences are important when they can be delivered as immediately as possible. But I also think we can have relationships in which we say, if you sell a seat to this program, next month you're going to get a bonus or whatever it is. I think we can bridge that gap, but I think timely consequences are important. Yeah. So Joe, I don't know that book. I always think of, I can't remember if it's Stephen Covey Jr. or Stephen Covey Jr. Jr. It's one of the three Stephen Coveys, has that book, The Speed of Trust. And while I'm not sure that it deserved a whole thick book about the topic, I think the notion is that if you have a trusting relationship with someone or with a team or with the organization, things get done more easily, decisions happen faster and all the rest of it. Yeah, 5 dysfunctions of a team. Okay, fair enough. And so it made perfect sense to me. But then to me, the notion that it's relationship between expectations and then how you follow up made a lot of sense to me. Oh, I'm sorry, Kayla. So I'm not sure. So this is a bummer. So let me see if I can. It kicked you out. That just is my incompetence. Um, okay, so Robert asked me if I were going into an organization that's struggling with employee engagement. I think where I would start is I would try to meet with leaders and or managers, with a team of leaders and managers, and I would probably use that framework that I showed you of best practices for leaders and managers, and I would ask them to assess to what extent they're doing those things. And what I think we would probably, and I would probably also, depending on what my relationship was, if I could actually go in and do this work, for example, at one of the larger ABA companies, probably 10 years ago, as many people here who were involved in behavioral health companies know, there's a big turnover often in frontline behavior technicians. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is that many of those people don't think of it as a career choice, it's just a job. But uh, I had a person who I was coaching her project, and she just went and interviewed a bunch of them. And what she found was kind of obvious stuff, like, oh, well, there's a policy that says I'm not going to I can't bill for this, but I'm supposed to develop relationships with the parents of the kids. So there's conflicting expectations, or we have this tool, but it doesn't work. And so you look into behavior influences that are involved with these people, and you say, oh, no wonder there's all these things that aren't working well. Now, might not be able to keep everybody working for you by optimizing that. But I think I would start, Robert, by both speaking, getting together with leadership and management and really looking at that set of best practices and seeing where we can make improvements, make stuff positive and aligned. And then I would probably, and that's something that in a certain way only an external consultant can do unless there's an enormous amount of trust already in the organization. And I would speak to the frontline workers or whoever it was that was a concern. And I would go through the 6 boxes and ask them, how's it working? What's working? What's not working? That's kind of how I would approach it. Yeah, I think Don's right. If trust is not happening and vulnerability, I think, yeah, Joe, I think that's exactly right. I think what you just said about that from the book, because again, if I know if I do something there'll be a response, an appropriate response, whether it's a positive consequence for my doing the right thing, or whether my asking a question and people don't treat me like I'm being stupid. If the relationship between box 1 and boxes 2 and 3 are positive, then it's probably going to work pretty well. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. Yeah, I mean, part of it, Kayla, that's a good point. I mean, I'm just, if people are looking in the trust, right, the chat box here, Kayla's talking about large kids with severe behavior problems. One of my sort of almost like jokes about box 3 is that some people are really good at tough stuff, whether it's the software engineer who's willing to work all weekend and every night to get problems done that nobody else can handle, or whether it's the person who does great with the big tough kids in a behavioral health organization and likes the challenge of not getting beat up and managing the kids and all that. That's a hard job. And sometimes things change with a software person. It might be they get a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and all of a sudden they don't want to spend their weekends. With the people with the big kids, it may be we always give them the tough ones. At some point, maybe it's too much. But I'm looking here at your comment about staffing. I can see how that's a big challenge. So that's box 2 has time in it. People don't often think of that, but there's a lot of kinds of businesses and kinds of professionals where you just keep getting more requirements for your job, and it's like, well, just come on, suck up, do it. And one of the best things I ever heard, and I don't know if this will apply in your context, Caleb, but probably not exactly, but one of the best things I ever saw was we were delivering our management program years ago to a software company. And there was a director in the room and then a bunch of managers who worked with him and some other folks too. And at some point we were talking about time as a box 2 resource. And he said, I tell my people, my managers that work for me, that I want them to spend like roughly about 10% of their time helping to develop their staff. And what I tell them, though, is if they find they can't do that because of other responsibilities, come to me and we'll reorganize your priorities so that you do have enough time to do that. Now, that's a rare thing because it's often the case, and you may well know this. People say, well, just do it, So I don't know if that will answer the issue that you're talking about there, Kayla. I think it's probably more complex than this. But the time thing, sometimes it's just both to be a comfortable human and to actually get the work done. Sometimes you have to allocate more time. And of course, in the business of billable hours and all that, that bumps up against profits and margins and all the rest of it. So there's a need for priority setting. And I think if you talk to the performers, the employees, and you do a sort of a scan of how things are in the various cells of the 6 boxes model, and things like time and anxiety or whatever come up, then at some point that has to go up and down the line of command where you say, well, how do we account for this? But I know that doesn't really answer it easily. Everybody's been, yeah, I think, well, so good luck with that, I guess I can say, Caleb, but I think you know what you're trying to go after. Your sentence about trying to work out the balance of billable time versus indirect meetings. And, to some extent, that's overhead. And you just say, this is part of the overhead, and we have to figure out how to account for that. Anyway, we're after the hour. Thank you for your engagement here toward the end and your questions. I like the EYS better than the YS. I was trying to figure that one out. Anyway, thanks everybody. Take care. Have a good rest of the day, and we won't be doing another one of these till September, but you'll surely get the notice when we do it. So thanks a lot.